Hi, everybody. Welcome to our video discussion for week 12. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about more contemporary American educational policy and some of the politics behind the debate. So I wanted to start off a little bit. Talking about how educational reform often centers around structural changes like markets and choice versus a focus on curriculum and instruction. So, oftentimes, sort of greater societal forces come into the education world with new ideas, which can sometimes be good and sometimes be bad. Um, this week, we're going to be looking at arguments for school choice, as well as the significant critiques of choice and the accountability movement, as well as um, some historical context shaping this debate. And then we're going to sort of wrap up a little bit with a postscript, kind of talking a little bit more about the consequences of Brown v. Board um, with another podcast episode. So I wanted to start us off with a sort of explicitly pro school choice article, and this is actually written from a think tank, a policy sort of research think tank um, called the AEI, which is the American Enterprise Institute. And we have here something from Michael McShane, and he's actually making a pro school choice argument from the perspective of somebody who was a teacher in a historically um, African American Black school. And this was, specifically a private school, it was a Catholic school. But basically, his argument is he saw sort of the abject failure that the public system of education had done to, or, had wrought upon students of color in his area. Um, and he gives us three core lessons or three arguments in favor of school choice. First off, he says that most public schools aren't truly public. His evidence to this essentially is oftentimes residential assignment and segregated neighborhoods can make public schools more racially and socioeconomically stratified. And we've already kind of seen and talked about this a little bit when we talked about Brown v. Board and its consequences. The access to a good public school, often requires a tuition, which is, an argument most often made against private schools, in the form of a higher mortgage or a house price, because often public school funding comes from property taxes in many areas. And so often schools in low socioeconomic areas often receive less funding because of the property taxes. And essentially, McShane says that private schools present choice as a way to offer academic alternatives without sacrificing the public mission of educating everybody for a common or a public good. His second point is that we should judge schools not by who manages them, but by how well they serve the idea of that good public education. And the goal is to educate children for a successful life in society. And so we should be open to any sorts of mechanisms essentially to achieve that. Like maybe public school works for some people, maybe private school works for other people, but there's a sort of freedom implied here that I think oftentimes, when we think of freedom, we think of sort of like an unqualified good. And finally, McShane is arguing that the idea of school choice empowers parents, and so it's putting the right people in charge as opposed to people who may have other priorities that are not in the best interest of their kids. And I will say we have heard some arguments to the contrary sometimes in this class of people saying that maybe parents aren't always the best people to put um, to elevate because sometimes they may not know what's best, but um, it is a compelling argument. um, so basically, we have McShane here offering a positive vision for school choice, but in the sort of bulk of our reading for this week from Diane Ravitch, we have sort of a critique of school choice and also um, a separate policy, which is testing accountability, um, from the position of somebody who was once an advocate, but who has now moved to a skeptic or an outright critic. And Diane Ravitch's the first chapter of our reading, she basically kind of gives a little bit of a autobiography talking about her own sort of transformation from a supporter of testing accountability to being not so much in favor. And I think one of the quotes I appreciated the most is when she said, "When the facts change, I change my mind." um, and essentially, I think what persuaded her, she says, is that she was initially attracted to the promise of a market-based reforms for a similar reason why McShane is saying basically is that the idea of freedom of the market, being able to kind of give everybody the choice that they can make, they want to make, everybody can do something in their own best interest, seems really appealing. And essentially, she has this interesting anecdote about, people that are self-interested, um, don't really make for the best policymakers, because then everybody would be trying to do something that might only benefit themselves. And she says essentially, nobody would have roads. We wouldn't have any sort of like public infrastructure if everybody was just sort of looking out for themselves. And so to have that sort of vision of a common good or a public good, or returning to that a little bit, you have to be able to see like a state. And that means thinking like a policymaker sort of from on high. You have to be able to look and think about what's good for the most people. And I thought, her after she says this, basically she says, this idea of market-based reforms and individual choice seems really appealing because in some ways it's sort of a get out of free jail card for some folks, because they say if we just let everybody decide what is best for them, then we don't really have to come up with a solution. And I think she sort of situates her own thinking of this, interestingly, at a time in the sort of like 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s where it's sort of the end of the Cold War and the sort of like you know, ideas of the free market can kind of fix everything were really, really ascendant and really popular at that time, um, on both sort of the American right as well as on the American left, the Democratic side. So you have like Ronald Reagan as mentioned, but also Bill Clinton. Um, and essentially, Ravitch, as she's talking about herself, she says that she concluded eventually that curriculum and instruction were more important than school choice and accountability. And school choice and accountability were sort of more of the conservative, that was the conservative interest, at least the conservative political interest at the time for education. And essentially, what she saw was that some of these things which seemed to be being put forward with good intention, um, were oftentimes harming schools more than they were helping. And a prime example of that is the sort of standardized testing reforms that began, especially with the piece of legislation that she talks about of No Child Left Behind. So essentially, she says that testing was becoming an end in itself. And if you hear of people talking about teaching to the test as opposed to teaching kids to learn or teaching kids, you know, to help to understand a topic, that's sort of the criticism that we're talking about here, is that, essentially we're only trying to teach to the thing which is the indication that students are supposed to be learning. It's sort of an artificial instrument, if that makes sense. Um, and essentially, um, Ravitch sort of makes this comparison between um, the one report, which is the Nation at Risk, where she says this came out of a conservative Republican government, Ronald Reagan at the time, which she saw initially as somewhat harmful because, in some ways, it scared um, non policymakers as well as policymakers, because it essentially talked about a lowering of academic achievement for students in the United States. But in her view, essentially, this report was far superior to the later policy that would come out of the Bush administration, which was No Child Left Behind, because it essentially gave schools the tools, or proposed reforms for schools to implement, that would hopefully address achievement in a slightly more holistic fashion, as opposed to um, the later testing implementation of No Child Left Behind, which basically kind of allowed it allowed schools and individual states to sort of set their own standards, but it changed the structure of education, where teachers were no longer just sort of teaching from textbooks, but they now had specific sorts of standards that were important for students uh, to meet, and therefore um, they could be punished if they weren't meeting those standards. Um, so I think essentially the argument that Ravitch is making here is that oftentimes the idea of measurement was in a way sort of trying to absolve educators and policymakers of more difficult conversations about problems with pedagogy and instruction, um, in a similar way to the idea of sort of like market reforms. And basically, just implementing a test um, isn't going to necessarily resolve issues with academic achievement, because, of course, there are questions of like, what are we measuring, as opposed to just, are people meeting this standard? Um, so the second part, I kind of wanted to include here, which is a little bit out of the realm of school choice and testing accountability, was another podcast episode, um, this time about kind of a perspective of Brown v. Board from the perspective of a teacher. And I sort of talked about this a little bit, I think a couple weeks ago, but uh, essentially, we've already sort of mentioned that there might have been some sort of flaws in the implementation of Brown v. Board and even potentially in the decision. But in this podcast episode by Malcolm Gladwell, he argues that there's sort of a foundational issue at play, which is that the plaintiffs were arguing about discrimination from a principle, which was that they thought their black school was actually good, but they believed that they deserved to have the choice to send their daughter to whatever school they wanted. Um, Consequently, on the part of the Supreme Court, they argued that it wasn't just about choosing where to send your kid. Having segregation actually completely actively harmed children who existed in segregated schools. And what that meant was they sort of assumed that Black children, African American children, being in Black or African American schools was inherently an undesirable phenomenon. And the kind of difference here between the two arguments that Gladwell says is that the plaintiffs, Leola Brown, were talking about a structural problem, which is basically questions of power and access. And the Supreme Court was basically arguing from a perspective of there's sort of a psychological harm that has been done to them. And what this led to was, in Gladwell's opinion, a catastrophic oversight in the process of desegregation and then subsequently integration. And that was, of course, ignoring teachers from the equation. And essentially, the issue here is that the court, in sort of all of its implementation efforts, was focused entirely on the integration of Black students and white students in schools. And they barely made any mention of teachers. And that is, of course, evidenced in the sort of story that we get in this podcast about Miss Buchanan. Essentially, Black children were being moved into potentially hostile environments without the support of Black teachers who had previously been nurturing them. This led to often the closing of these Black schools or African American schools, and the mass firing of Black teachers. I think we get a statistic saying that around 82,000 Black teachers lost their jobs in the fallout of Brown versus Board. And oftentimes the justifications for this were based on sort of intangible, racially coded critiques, like resentful towards authority or uppity. And basically, Gladwell says the ranks of Black teachers have never recovered, which I think is critical because research shows that Black students perform significantly better with at least one Black teacher in their career. So I think we can see uh, basically the consequences of policy implementation through sort of both an examination of some of the fallout of Brown v. Board, but also from Diane Ravitch's readings today as well. And I don't want to necessarily disqualify the arguments for the pro school choice movement, but at least I think it's important to reconcile some of the critiques that are being made, and also think about how good intentions can sometimes lead to negative outcomes, depending on just the implementation of policy as well as its mechanisms, I suppose. So, thank you guys all for listening, and have a great week.